On August 1st, 2025, Donald Trump tried to bring Canada to its knees. He thought he could crush a G7 ally with a single swipe of his executive pen. With a 35% tariff increase slapped across a wide range of Canadian exports, Trump expected panic, collapse, a desperate phone call from Ottawa begging for relief. But that's not what...
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
Because what happened next wasn't desperation. It was discipline. It was strategy. It was Carney-Level leadership. Mark Carney, Canada's calm and calculating prime minister, didn't flinch. He didn't grandstand. He didn't rush to the cameras. Because he didn't have to. Canada was ready. Months of preparation. Quiet restructuring. Diversified exports. Onshore production. USMCA protections. And one very important principle, Canada bows to no one, especially not a president using trade as a weapon of political blackmail. Trump's move wasn't just aggressive. It was personal. Just weeks earlier, Carney's government had recognized Palestinian statehood, a bold, sovereign decision rooted in international law and Canada's values. And it enraged Trump, not because it harmed U.S. interests, but because it challenged his sense of control. Trump doesn't tolerate independent thought, especially not from allies he considers junior partners. So he retaliated in the only way he knows how, economic coercion dressed up as America First. But it backfired, spectacularly, because 95% of Canadian exports to the U.S. were already protected under the USMCA. The 35% tariff hike, it only touched a slim fraction of the trade balance. And even those targeted industries had already shifted logistics, diversified clients, and hedged against exactly this kind of chaos. Trump fired a bazooka and hit nothing but smoke. Take Canadian wine, for example. Trump's tariffs were meant to crush luxury exports like wine, cheese, and craft goods. But what happened instead? Domestic wine sales in Canada surged, up 60% in Quebec alone. Small producers, once relying on the U.S. market, turned their attention inward. Canadian consumers responded with patriotism and pride, buying local and boosting entire sectors of the economy that had previously lived in America's economic shadow. The same story played out across steel, aluminum, pharmaceuticals, agriculture. Canadian companies used the moment not as a setback, but as a pivot point. New contracts, new investments, onshoring, strategic stockpiling, regional integration with Europe and Asia. Trump tried to build a wall. Canada built a ladder. And this wasn't just the federal government. This was national unity in action. Doug Ford, Ontario's Conservative premier and no stranger to political friction with Ottawa, publicly demanded retaliation. He didn't just support Carney's position, he amplified it. Premiers across the political spectrum, from Alberta to Nova Scotia, rallied behind the Prime Minister. The message was clear. This wasn't about left or right. This was about sovereignty. Canada was done playing the role of America's polite neighbor, done tolerating trade tantrums, done absorbing economic blows for the sake of diplomacy. This time, Canada stood its ground, and the world took notice. While Trump pounded his podium and promised economic ruin, Canada looked like the adult in the room. Carney's response was strategic silence, followed by surgical retaliation. Not chaotic counter-tariffs, not blustering rhetoric, just precision. A tightening of export licenses, a pause on rarer shipments, strategic slowdowns at key border crossings that exposed just how dependent U.S. manufacturers remain on Canadian supply chains. American producers, especially in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, felt the heat instantly. Auto parts didn't arrive on time. Machinery backlogs formed. Border towns saw trade volume drop and prices rise. And suddenly, Trump's 35% tariff looked less like a power play and more like economic self-sabotage. And the cherry on top? Trump's obsession with the optics meant he'd spent more time on TV yelling about tariffs than actually listening to his own economists. Had he done so, he would have learned that Canada's top exports, critical minerals, energy, technology components, were already tied up in long-term contracts with multinationals who had zero interest in renegotiating for the sake of Trump's latest tantrum. He launched a trade war with no leverage. Meanwhile, Canada had spent months quietly realigning its trade flows, strengthening ties with the EU, doubling down on partnerships with India and Japan, securing long-term LNG contracts with South Korea, opening fresh agricultural routes into the Gulf states. These weren't press releases, they were structural changes. And when Trump struck on August 1st, Canada's trade engine didn't stall, it shifted gears. That's what Trump never saw coming. His economic warfare was based on the assumption that Canada was fragile, dependent, emotionally attached to American approval. But Carney understood something deeper. Canada's strength wasn't in its GDP. It was in its resilience, in its unity, in its ability to take a hit and use it to build something better. And the Canadian people felt that. They saw it. Instead of outrage, they responded with resolve. Buy Canadian campaigns went viral. Farmers' markets exploded with demand. Local industries began retooling. A national moment was born, not in the flames of retaliation, but in the calm, steady beat of self-respect. Let's not pretend this was easy. Canadian businesses took a hit. Some exporters had to pivot quickly. Some jobs were disrupted. But unlike in the U.S., where Trump's erratic policies leave workers stranded and investors spooked, Canada had a plan, a real one. Emergency lending programs were activated. Provinces coordinated with Ottawa to provide targeted relief. Trade missions were launched within days. Canadian resilience wasn't theoretical, it was institutional. And while Trump yelled into the void, Carney picked up the phone. He wasn't just talking to allies, he was building coalitions. At the UN, Canada's decision to recognize Palestine, once seen as controversial, was now being reinterpreted as visionary. In Brussels, Carney was received not just as a national leader, but as a symbol of global steadiness in a time of economic chaos. Back in the U.S., the picture was different. Trump's tariffs had set off a firestorm, but the flames were in his own backyard. Industry groups began turning on him. Republican governors in border states begged for relief. Farm lobbies revolted. Editorial boards asked, what did this achieve? And Trump? He doubled down, because that's all he knows. Attack, escalate, distract. But this time, Canada didn't take the bait. And that restraint, more than any single countermeasure, was what truly exposed Trump. His entire strategy relied on escalation, on forcing a reaction, on dragging Canada into the mud, so he could pretend he was still in control. But when Carney refused to play along, Trump was left alone in the spotlight, raging while Canada quietly walked off the stage. And into the future. What comes next? Canada is already rolling out an ambitious new round of trade diversification measures. Domestic industrial policy is being reimagined with focus on high-value manufacturing, green energy, and food sovereignty. The wine boom in Quebec? Just the beginning. Expect more local revolutions in sectors that once leaned too heavily on U.S. access. What Trump did on August 1st was light a fire, but it's burning in Canada's favor. And Trump? He'll keep screaming. But the damage is done, not to Canada's economy, but to America's credibility. Because this wasn't just a trade blunder. It was a global humiliation. A superpower tried to bully its neighbor and lost. Badly. Mark Carney didn't just survive the tariffs. He outclassed them. And now, as Canada forges new trade corridors and reclaims its industrial autonomy, the world sees a different nation, not just a quiet, polite country in America's shadow, but a smart, sovereign, strategic force. Trump imposed a 35% tariff, and in doing so, he handed Canada its independence. He thought he could crush Canada's spine. Instead, he proved its strength. And now that strength is unmistakable. With every sector of the Canadian economy adapting, recalibrating, and accelerating toward independence, Trump's gambit is being exposed for what it was, a desperate attempt to impose control of a world that no longer bends his will. His August 1st tariff hike was meant to project dominance, but it has become the symbol of his decline and Canada's rise. Let's talk numbers, because in politics, narratives matter, but markets speak louder. In the month following Trump's 35% tariff escalation, Canadian exports to the U.S. dropped slightly, but global exports surged. Diversification wasn't a theory, it was a survival blueprint. Trade volume to Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia filled the gap. Canadian ports like Halifax and Prince Rupert reported record container volumes as goods rerouted to newer, friendlier markets. This wasn't a collapse. It was an evolution. And the real kicker? Many of the American companies affected by the tariffs began lobbying not for Canada to make concessions, but for Trump to back off. Agriculture associations, car manufacturers, and steel-dependent industries flooded Washington with complaints. From Indiana to Iowa, business leaders asked the same question. How does it help the U.S. economy to jack up prices on imported materials, alienate a stable partner, and trigger retaliation that cuts off supply chains? Because Trump may think in slogans, but economies function on reality, and the reality is that America needs Canadian goods just as much as Canada once depended on U.S. markets. The imbalance Trump thought he could exploit simply doesn't exist anymore. Canada has options. American dependency, not so easy to unwind. In fact, it's the U.S. now facing major logistical disruptions. Manufacturers, particularly in the Midwest and South, are dealing with sudden shortages in aluminum, timber, and chemical compounds that came almost exclusively from Canada. This isn't just about wine or cheese. This is about core inputs that keep American factories running. And with Canada redirecting those resources toward other partners, Trump has triggered a domestic crisis for his own industrial base. Let's not forget the strategic brilliance in Carney's silence. He didn't need to retaliate with bluster because he'd already done the work years ago. Even before Trump's 2024 re-election, Carney's administration quietly reshaped Canada's economic trajectory. He leaned into supply chain resilience. He negotiated multi-continent trade compacts. He used federal power to accelerate local industry and reduce import reliance. So when Trump pulled the lever, it wasn't connected to anything fragile. And when Carney did speak, it wasn't to provoke, it was to lead. In a carefully worded statement days after the tariffs, he said, Canada's economic future will not be dictated by the impulses of another country's leader. We stand on our own terms in defense of our values, our sovereignty, and our global partnerships. That was it. No inflammatory pressers. No reactive anger. Just confidence. And that confidence echoed around the world. Australia reached out for a clean energy tech partnership. India proposed a new food security corridor between Canadian grain growers and Indian markets. Germany opened talks for joint investment in rare earth mineral extraction in northern Canada. These aren't just headlines. They're signs of a new trade paradigm. Canada isn't just reacting to a crisis. It's leading a movement. And if you think this isn't driving Trump absolutely mad, you haven't been paying attention. He wanted to show the world that he still held the cards, that he could still dictate terms to U.S. allies, that America could still be the sheriff in the global economy. But what he proved instead is that America is the unstable partner, a country whose foreign policy can swing wildly depending on the mood of one man, a country where diplomacy is decided on truth social, not through statecraft. Trump thought he was punishing Canada for recognizing Palestine. But here's what actually happened. Canada asserted moral leadership, refused to be blackmailed, and earned global respect. Trump tried to isolate Carney and ended up isolating himself. U.S. allies in the EU didn't back the tariffs. Neither did Japan, South Korea, or the U.K. The G7 summit that followed was a brutal contrast. Carney surrounded by quiet respect, Trump trailing a trail of nervous aides and fraying alliances. And let's talk about the domestic political effects. In Canada, the public didn't see the August 1st tariffs as a moment of weakness. They saw them as a test of national identity. And the reaction was electric. Buy Canadian became more than a hashtag. It became a movement. Consumers flooded local markets. National chains pivoted to local suppliers. The wine boom was just the beginning. Maple syrup exports spiked. Quebec cheesemakers saw record orders. Alberta beef found new buyers in the UAE. Even more impressively, young Canadians who had never paid attention to trade policy began talking about sovereignty, about values, about independence. Trump wanted to humiliate Canada, but he accidentally sparked a generational patriotism that no campaign could have manufactured. Meanwhile, in America, Trump faced the opposite: division, confusion, anger. His base, already stretched thin from inflation and erratic governance, began asking hard questions. Why was their president waging war against an ally while cutting deals with authoritarian states? Why were their factories shutting down because of the spat over foreign policy decisions in another country? And what answer could Trump offer? That Canada should have backed down? That sovereignty should be sacrificed for trade peace? That a 35% tariff was a proportionate response to an act of moral diplomacy? It doesn't hold up. It never did. But in Trump's world, logic doesn't matter. Appearances do. And the appearance now, both to the American people and to the global community, is clear. Trump picked a fight and got embarrassed. And that embarrassment isn't going away. Because Canada isn't just weathering the storm. It's building something new. An economic future rooted in local strength, global partnerships, and an unshakable belief that doing the right thing should not come with a penalty. This is the new Canada. Not just a trading partner. Not just a G7 member. But a country that can stand up to the most volatile president in modern American history and win. Trump imposed a 35% tariff, believing it would bring Canada to heel. Instead, he exposed America's weakness, validated Canada's strength, and launched a new era of Canadian independence. This wasn't just a Carney-Level rejection. It was a Carney-Level revolution, and the world is watching. The revolution didn't come with fireworks or fury. It came with calm, with quiet conviction, with the kind of leadership that doesn't scream, doesn't panic, doesn't posture. It simply acts. That's Mark Carney. While Trump was ranting on stage in Michigan, blaming Canada for his own collapsing poll numbers, Carney was in Vancouver finalizing a trade agreement with ASEAN nations, calmly tightening Canada's ties to Southeast Asia's growing economies. That's what true leadership looks like. And the numbers prove it. Canadian exports to ASEAN have jumped 22% since the August 1st tariffs. Direct investment from European firms is up. Even Canadian tech startups are seeing interest from investors once loyal to Silicon Valley, investors who are now fed up with American instability and looking north, where regulations are clear, institutions are steady, and the government doesn't start trade wars for headlines. Carney didn't just win a standoff. He set a new tone for what it means to govern in an era of geopolitical volatility. And Canadians know it. They feel it. Because for the first time in decades, they're not watching their leaders scramble to appease Washington. They're watching them lead. They're watching Canada take its place in the world as a confident, capable, values-driven power. Not because it begged for approval, but because it earned respect. This transformation is bigger than any single policy. It's cultural. It's foundational. It's in the way Canadian media talks about international politics now, with clarity and purpose. It's in the way young voters talk about sovereignty, not as a relic of the past, but as a prerequisite for a secure and just future. It's in the way local businesses now frame their ambitions, not as exporting to America, but as owning our space in the world. Trump, for all his bluster, handed Canada a gift, the opportunity to break the addiction to U.S. validation. And Carney took that opportunity with both hands. The result is a Canada that's more self-reliant, more globally engaged, and more unified than it's been in decades. And the contrast with Trump's America couldn't be clearer. While Canada projects steadiness, Trump projects chaos. While Canada builds long-term strategies, Trump lurches from crisis to crisis. While Canada asserts values, Trump weaponizes trade to attack them. It's no wonder that international headlines aren't reading Canada in trouble. They're reading Canada resists, Trump retreats. And retreat he has. Quietly, of course, because Trump never admits defeat. But in the corridors of Capitol Hill, the message is clear. De-escalate, recalculate, retreat. The same GOP senators who clapped for Trump's tariff increase are now trying to convince USDR officials to undo the damage. MAGA Republicans who once championed America First are now watching their donors lose contracts, their voters lose jobs, and their credibility melt under the heat of economic blowback. Even Fox News, usually the last to abandon Trump's fantasies, has started questioning whether the Canada tariffs were a mistake. When they break ranks, you know the foundation is crumbling. And all the while, Carney just keeps going. He doesn't celebrate the win. He doesn't spike the football. Because for him, it was never about Trump. It was about Canada. About preparing the country for a world where resilience isn't optional. About ensuring that the next generation of Canadians won't have to hope the White House likes them. They'll know that they can stand on their own, trade on their own terms, and act according to their values without fear of economic retribution. That's what makes this moment so important. It wasn't just a fight about tariffs. It was a referendum on independence. And Canada passed it with flying colors. The road ahead won't be without challenges. Trump's America is still unpredictable, and future flare-ups are likely. But Canada is ready now. Not reactive, ready. And that makes all the difference. Because once a country learns that it can survive pressure from a superpower, it doesn't just breathe easier. It starts planning boldly. And those bold plans are already being executed. Canada's investment in green infrastructure has doubled in just 3 months. Rare earth mining projects in northern Quebec and Labrador are being fast-tracked, with European and Asian partners eager to break their dependency on Chinese supply. Canadian aerospace firms are opening new R&D facilities to supply not just domestic demand, but growing international defense and commercial contracts. Even energy exports, long dominated by oil and gas, are shifting toward LNG, hydroelectric, and hydrogen-based innovations. And here's the kicker. American companies are coming to Canada, not to dominate, but to survive. They're opening satellite offices, diversifying their supply chains, begging Canadian regulators for predictability they can't find back home. Because Trump didn't just fracture a trade deal, he fractured trust. And in global economics, trust is everything. It's what keeps ports moving, currency stable, contract enforceable. And right now, if you had to choose between betting on Trump's impulsive America or Carney's strategic Canada, the smart money is heading north. Because while Trump is still yelling about respect, Canada is earning it. From world leaders, from investors, from its own people. Trump thought he could make Canada fold. Instead, he made it flourish. He forced the country to find its backbone, to clarify its values, to draw its line in the sand. And when the pressure came, Carney didn't blink. He walked straight through it, with a nation behind him. This isn't just the end of a tariff dispute. This is the beginning of something much bigger. A Canada that no longer fears confrontation with its southern neighbor. A Canada that no longer flinches when bullied by bigger economies. A Canada that no longer defines itself by proximity to America, but by its own principles, power, and purpose. Trump fired the first shot. Canada fired none. And yet, it's Trump who lost the war. Because power isn't in how loudly you threaten. It's in how quietly you endure. And Carney? He endured. He outlasted. He outsmarted. And now, as the dust settles and the world takes stock, only one leader walks away with his credibility intact. It's not the one ranting on a stage in Ohio. It's the one calmly reshaping the world from Ottawa. And the lesson, now etched into history, is simple. Never underestimate the strength of a country that knows who it is. Canada just proved it. And Trump? He just proved that bullying a principled nation only makes it stronger.